The Cold War. Nuclear weapons threaten all mankind. They're protected by special bunkers. High-end technology against a destructive power which makes entire landscapes inhospitable forever. Mushrooms of concrete as far as the eye can see, when bunker mania takes hold of a country's leaders. A missile base, a civil alert center, a communications bunker, and a countryside full of midget bunkers reflect the dangers of the nuclear age. Fear of nuclear strikes dominates the years of the Cold War. Both military alliances, the Warsaw Pact in the east, as well as NATO in the west, have stacked their arsenals with nuclear warheads. The Warsaw Pact comprises most of the states in the Eastern Bloc, among them the GDR, or East Germany. NATO is made up of most West European states, and the FRG, or the Federal Republic of Germany. The Soviet Union, by then the largest country in the world, has deployed the bulk of its missiles along its western borders. From there, they can reach the NATO states in Europe, from a top-secret base like this one in northern Lithuania. Strange cupolas of concrete in the sealed-off woods of Plokština. They're part of an underground missile base in use until 1978. Next to the site, there are barracks for 300 soldiers and officers. The area is barely inhabited. Its residents haven't a clue of what's going on inside.
Once I was picking berries along the fence. They came up in a jeep and told me, "This is a forbidden area, no picking of berries here." As I spoke a bit of Russian by then, I said, "What? I've been picking berries here all my life." But they just said, "Care to be taken along to our headquarters?"
Above the bunker entrance, a reminder in red: wipe your feet. Behind it, a hidden world. One of many which proliferate in the remote woods of Lithuania during the 1960s.
The shafts were dug within the better part of a year and reinforced with concrete. At the same time, military and civil technicians worked on the pit for the so-called technological block. There was a power plant, installations for steering and radio communications. The entire area was planned in such a way that it was possible to lead a normal life there.
The command bunker and the 4 shafts for medium-range missiles are completed by December 1962. By then, the Americans have been installing their missiles in underground silos for some time. They're kept in a constant state of readiness for that one lethal launch. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 has convinced the Russian military of the need for camouflage. Back then, US reconnaissance planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles on the Caribbean island, right on the doorstep of the continental United States.
It was extremely dangerous. The Soviet Union was incredibly nervous because there were American nuclear stations in Turkey, and of course all across Western Europe, so that it extended Soviet nuclear capability and threatened directly the United States. It doesn't mean to say that Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was going to ever enact it, but it was saying, okay, you Americans, you've got missiles pointing at us from Turkey and from Western Europe. We've now got one pointing from Cuba.
The SS-4 and SS-5 missiles have a range of 2,000 and 4,500 kilometers respectively. This would take them well into US territory. Mankind is on the brink of World War III. In the end, the Soviets back down and redeploy their rockets. It's been nuclear poker on a grand scale. From now on, MAD, or mutually assured destruction, becomes a household word.
During the Cold War, both sides permanently updated their strategy. Each side knew the number of their available warheads and performed war games with a view to analyzing if the enemy could be decapitated in a nuclear first strike, once World War III was imminent.
In East and West alike, the military plan with strategic as well as tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical missiles have a lower range and less destructive power. They're intended for use against military targets on a limited battlefield. Strategic missiles are directed against intercontinental targets. Their explosive power is aimed at destroying the enemy's infrastructure and entire cities. Statistics from the nuclear arsenals. In 1962, the United States have 27,300 warheads at their disposal, the Soviet Union a mere 3,300. In 1970, the number of US warheads is at 26,100, while that of the Soviet Union is at 11,650. In 1978, the Soviet Union is ahead by 900 warheads. A fraction of them would have been enough to destroy Earth completely. Both sides consider the option of war under nuclear conditions. In the East, nuclear policy is a matter of strictest secrecy. Outside the top level, hardly anyone knows about the real dangers. In the West, people time and again demonstrate against nuclear armament. Politicians are facing the protests of a new multi-layered peace movement. The dangers of nuclear deterrence are discussed openly.
It's simply impossible to protect yourself against nuclear arms, at least not on a grand scale. You may create sheltered spaces for a certain number of people, i.e. the leading politicians and the military top brass, but never for the entire population. Any nuclear war would have decimated the population to a degree that both sides refrained from using nuclear weapons.
Both sides remain fixed in a deadlock of mutual fear. The transport of missiles to their base is always a top-secret affair. However, as in Lithuania, there are occasional witnesses.
The most dangerous things we saw were the rocket transports, right after darkness had fallen. Those trucks were huge, and the missiles too, with their pointed ends, were immensely long. They were escorted by cross-country vehicles, two in the front and one behind, sometimes two. They moved very, very slowly. You would have been faster on foot.
The layout of a standard Soviet missile base. Each of the 4 missiles is lowered into its silo of concrete and readied for launch. Including the warhead, they measure about 22 meters. Their NATO codename, SS-4. They have a life expectancy of 10 to 15 years. Their range, about 2,000 kilometers, allows them to reach targets like Berlin, Brussels, Paris, or Milan. With any launch, the concrete silo would burn out due to the heat. An immense effort for just one shot.
We're talking about millions of rubles. The site had to be constantly guarded. The security measures were extreme. Once there was a small fire in one of the shafts. All the top brass raced to the scene. Something had fallen onto the floor plate and started to burn. Everyone was pale with fear. In the end, they managed to extinguish the fire.
The final procedure when installing an SS-4 is the mounting of the warhead. Working with nuclear material requires special security measures. Everyone is obliged to wear protective suits. The explosive power of a warhead like this is near to a megaton, 70 times the effect of Hiroshima. Every 3 or 4 years, the missiles are programmed for new targets, depending on shifts in Soviet foreign policy.
NATO is really threatened by Soviets' nuclear capability. I mean, to start off with, it's just those powers in Western Europe, because they're the only ones within range, because to start off with, nuclear warheads are delivered by aircraft. But by the late 1960s, they're being delivered by submarines. And that gives you the capability to go pretty much anywhere in the world. So nowhere is safe.
Meanwhile, the Americans are busy too. Each of the two superpowers is eager to locate the silos of its opponent. Mutual suspicion is rife.
When satellites became available, the Americans used them to fly over vast parts of the Soviet Union. And in spring 1967, one of their spy satellites detected this base. We know that because its coordinates show up in their list of top-secret Soviet military installations.
If a missile had been launched from this silo, there would have been an instant nuclear counterstrike. With devastating consequences for soldiers and local civilians. In spite of the level of secrecy imposed on the base, there are contacts between the crew and the locals.
I personally didn't engage in any friendships. Some of the others did. They were always eager for samogon, the local moonshine. So there was contact, and the residents knew what we were doing here, even better than us.
There's a regular coming and going in the barracks storerooms. They're turned into a market where army goods are traded for the much sought-after samogon.
They gave us chicken wire, quilted jackets, blankets, bed sheets, everything they had, even meat and lard. We got everything their stores would offer.
The Plokština bunker is a self-contained unit with its own ventilation system and filter installations. A diesel engine, once built for a submarine, provides electricity. Space for a tank with 85 tons of fuel for the rockets. About 30 officers and enlisted men were supposed to be able to survive underground for 15 days. The base never launches a missile in anger. In 1978, it's considered obsolete. 1 year later, the Soviet army leaves Plokština.
Of course, the locals made the best of it and pilfered the base. Only the missiles and certain parts had been dismantled. Various motors and cables had been left behind, as were all sorts of iron parts and non-ferrous metal. It was only much later that we got to know what this site had actually been.
In 2011, the bunker becomes a Cold War museum. It's to demonstrate to young Lithuanians how their country once played a key role in the nuclear strategy of the Soviet Union. And it's to serve as a memento of the dangers of a confrontation that may easily have turned the Cold War into a hot one. Along the Iron Curtain, the two ideological opponents face each other in direct confrontation. Here, the implications of a nuclear war loom largest. Basel in northwest Germany. Here, like at numerous places in West Germany, the Federal Office of Civil Protection has established an alert center. It's a secret bunker. intended to function as a regional headquarters in case of war. Alert Center 2 in Basum was active from 1959 to 1995. Mirko Krum has set himself the task of upholding the memory of that era. This is where civil employees would sit, ready around the clock, preparing for an emergency, be it nuclear, biological or chemical.
I think it's really important to understand that this was a very, very real threat. You know, it was total Armageddon scenario, and it was something that was taken incredibly seriously by all sides, by the Soviet Union, by NATO, the Western forces, and of course by the United States as well.
West Germany is subdivided into 10 alert sectors. They process incoming messages about relevant incidents or attacks.
Sector Center 2 received the messages by telephone, that's to say mainly via the telex network or by directional radio.
Telex, by then in widespread use, is a communication device which delivers content via punched paper tape, which is then translated into a readable text. In the filter room, all incoming information is pooled and then analysed using special stencils, which allow the consequences of a nuclear fallout to be predicted.
This is a stencil for the evaluation of nuclear detonations. There's the point of impact, and around it several radii according to the presumed number of kilotons. For Wilhelmshaven, estimates ran up to 300 kilotons. So within this radius, severe nuclear damage must be expected. There'll be a radioactive cloud, and given a wind speed of 70 kilometers per hour, it will have spread to here within an hour, and within 2 hours it will have reached Hamburg.
The centre then sounds the alarm using sirens and issues warnings via the broadcast stations.
This is the Air Raid Warning Service. ABC alarm west of the Weser River. Proceed at once to a shelter, a basement, or seek provisional cover. Over.
Devices for the detection of nuclear, biological or chemical contamination.
The NATO treaties had a pretty clear picture of what the Warsaw Pact countries, and particularly the Soviet Union, were up to. You know, this is the age of spies and Smiley and all the rest of it, and secret agents. You know, lots of spying going on. Also, the Russians were quite slack on this, so intelligence did get out. And, you know, there was this tit for tat. You know, equally, the Warsaw Pact countries had a pretty clear idea of what was going on with the NATO countries. And actually, on both cases, this wasn't necessarily about a bad thing, because the fear of what they had actually was a pretty good incentive not to go to war.
Maps in the command room illustrate the strategic implications.
This map is labelled 7 days to the Rhine. It was produced by a Polish general as part of a war game at the end of the 1980s. The scenario presumes the escalation of the Cold War and shows the 3 main axes of advance from east to west. It also shows the intended use of nuclear weapons, as well as the assumed counterstrikes by NATO forces in red and blue, respectively, divided into ground or air bursts. You can clearly see that there would have been a lot of nuclear impacts the further west you go, and, of course, in the middle of Germany.
A war game that reflects most realistically the strategy envisaged by the Eastern forces. It also shows that the West was preparing for the possibility of a first strike by the Warsaw Pact. People in West Germany are in no doubt that their country may be turned into a nuclear wasteland.
The idea was that the Warsaw Pact forces would charge to the Rhine within a few days, assuming that NATO would take too much time to agree at which points to react first and where to retaliate by nuclear strikes. So the basic presumption was that the Warsaw Pact would simply create facts.
In the bunkers of the alert centers, employees of the Civil Protection Service practice how to cope with nuclear strikes. Hans-Dieter Bayer was in charge of Alert Center 1 in northern Germany.
We worked in shifts around the clock with 2 people on night duty. Outside the bunker, there were accommodation rooms and the office building. That's where we would sit at our desks most of the time, while down in the bunker, only the technicians would be on constant duty.
The bunker is laid out over 4 stories, reaching 16 meters deep. Its only access is the main entrance, complete with an airlock, a decontamination room, and an emergency exit. Life under condition red in the bunker has to be trained.
We once did a trial run with a fully manned staff. That meant 180 people locked up for 7 days. So life down there had to be organized. All installations, including the ventilation, were activated. We had to cater for ourselves, and we were on duty around the clock. We had to process messages and to react as if it were the real thing.
The bunkers are designed to withstand detonations of up to 20 kilotons close by. That's the impact of 20,000 kilograms of explosives within a radius of 1 kilometer. The bunker walls and the ceiling are 3 meters thick, made of a special concrete mixed with barite, a mineral with anti-radioactive features. The bunker as a whole weighs 46,000 tons, the equivalent of the Titanic, compressed into 30 by 30 meters underground.
The bunker is laid out for a self-contained period of 30 days. It was assumed that there would be a political advance warning before any conflict broke out in full. That would allow the reserves to be activated and to bring the bunker up to its full war strength of 200 people.
200 people in a confined space for 30 days, while above, a nuclear war is raging. The prerequisites are an autonomous supply of electricity and water, clean air, and protection against heat and radioactivity, a massive technical challenge.
This is the air intake installation where the incoming air is filtered and cooled. If it were for real, these would be radioactive particles. When the outside air passes through here, the coarseness of the granulation provides a very good cooling effect. With estimated outside temperatures of 1,000 degrees Celsius, the heat is supposed to be diminished by 950 degrees.
Additional filters and cooling installations guarantee a room temperature of 23 degrees Celsius. An elaborate and expensive technology for a comparatively low number of people. Yet their work may save countless lives, especially in a limited nuclear emergency.
In my view, that was the main reason for the existence of the Civil Protection Service. If there had been a single nuclear strike by mistake, so to speak, we could at least have achieved something. However, if both sides had fired off all they had, there had been nothing left.
With nuclear annihilation all around, even the most sophisticated technology cannot keep entire countries from being devastated. The nuclear arms race, a recipe for disaster. It may guarantee deterrence, but no safety. Strausberg, near Berlin. A special bunker completed in 1984, 40 kilometers away from the East German capital. An inconspicuous functional building in the middle of a wood. Nothing here points to anything out of the ordinary. Next to an unobtrusive guardhouse, the entrance. Beyond it, there's another world. The basement is one huge bunker, 70 by 70 meters. 196 rooms laid out over 2 levels. Total space available, 10,000 square meters. It's a communication center, the most important on the territory of the German Democratic Republic. Yet unlike the West German alert centers, it's not designed to warn the population, but to ensure that the country's leaders will be able to stay in control of things.
The degree of protection of this bunker was especially high. This one was classed B, the second highest degree.
A high degree of protection with secrecy to match. Those who work here are under the strictest obligation of confidentiality. Nothing filters to the outside. In the city of Strausberg, nobody knows what's going on in here. There are rumors, though.
We were under oath not to talk to anyone outside, and of course we knew we'd better stick to it. The consequences of any breach of confidentiality would have been, well, you can imagine. During the construction of the bunker we had a lot of fun, though. There was a dismantled crane on a nearby road, and in the trams you could hear people talking about it being part of the casings for SS-20 missiles, which were supposed to be stationed nearby.
The Strausberg bunker is a civilian installation, yet it's of the utmost strategic importance. The East German Railroad has a communication network of its own. So have the cabinet, the mail, and the military. If that were not enough, there's another top-secret network. Strausberg is the hub, the nerve center where all these networks are linked.
One of East Germany's most important communication networks was the so-called Special Network 1. In a way, it wasn't a network on its own, but a system through which civilian and military lines of communications could be used to link important political bodies with each other.
A hotline between the military and the party top brass, all in preparation for the day of days, when NATO would strike with nuclear weapons.
Special Network 1 would have been the means of giving the general alert via the usual telecommunication lines, in addition to army-run systems of spreading the alarm. After that, it probably would have gone offline due to the impact of enemy arms.
The communications bunker is one of the largest and best protected installations in the country. At the entrance, an airlock. This is where officers and enlisted men would leave their contaminated equipment, uniforms, and protective suits. The technical installations, too, are protected by special features.
Throughout the bunker, any relevant part has been put on bouncers, so that even the shockwave of a nuclear detonation could be absorbed.
High tech, protected by the simplest of means. The electric cabinets, too, are buffered by steel springs on the ceiling. A special filter system to purify the contaminated air coming in from outside. The clean air is then distributed to the various sections of the bunker via large ducts. And there are additional reserves.
Here we have 6 containers, similar to a diver's scuba tank, which contained compressed oxygen. This was supposed to last for 24 hours in case of an emergency, so the personnel inside the bunker could be supplied with sufficient air to carry on for a day.
The dispatcher room, the heart of the bunker. It's here that all relevant data are recorded and monitored, such as the air pressure, and notably the temperature, since the huge installations heat up and thus have to be cooled. From here, all doors can be locked, and the air filter system too will be run by remote control.
We worked round the clock in 3 shifts. So we were on constant duty, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Outside regular hours, we did maintenance work, and when we were down here during the weekends, special care was taken to rehearse the proper handling of the technical installations and all the procedures that went with them.
Outside, there's only a small mound. On top of it, an inconspicuous roof construction, intended to lure enemy reconnaissance into thinking that this was just a meeting place for the foresters. Below, however, there's a giant block of concrete. Only the vent pipes give away the presence of an underground building. On top of the actual bunker, a specially designed lair. Its purpose is twofold.
There aren't just walls with a thickness of 1 meter. There's also an intermediate level on top of the 2 working levels. And on top of that, there is a so-called anti-impact layer. All this was supposed to give a smart bomb the impression that it had already penetrated the bunker, when in reality it was still in the intermediate level, and thus outside the actual bunker.
However, despite all the technological ingenuity, the protective measures will merely have a short-term effect. The lasting consequences of a nuclear strike are ignored, as they can't be managed anyway.
Our brief was, go down there and carry on for at least 14 days in self-containment. Apart from that, it was shut the doors and do your duty as best as possible. That was all the information we were given. Anything else was quite deliberately kept from us.
The former command room of the Minister for Mail and Telecommunications, where he and his staff would redeploy in an emergency. It may well have been that these corridors would have resounded with Russian orders, since East Germany is part of the Warsaw Pact.
The Soviet army had no immediate access to this bunker, but this could have been easily arranged or even enforced. In case of an emergency, the Soviet army would have had overall control of all military activities within the Warsaw Pact, and thus automatically have access to all bunkers in East Germany.
The East German military has only limited scope to act on their own. It's the generals in Moscow who pulled the strings. Yet, as a frontline state in the Cold War, East Germany is of the utmost strategic importance. It's from here that the machinery of war will be run. A fact that puts the country firmly in the sights of NATO forces.
East Germany and West Germany would have been absolutely central to any Third World War. Whoever's launching it will be launched from one country or the other. You know, if it's from the Warsaw Pact, it would be launched from East Germany. If it's from NATO, it would be launched from West Germany. And there is, you know, both countries have an incredibly large build-up of forces, you know, which is why you've got all these bunkers there to command and control the battle safely and securely from their kind of nuclear bunkers, and to keep the whole thing, the whole show on the road, really.
The telecommunications staff at Strasbourg are mere pawns in the superpowers game. Tiny cogs in the gearbox of mutual destruction. Extensive bunker building proves a severe strain on the East German economy. Yet it's a political must, even if the civilian sector is lacking resources wherever you look. Until the demise of East Germany, almost 100 bunkers are built. For the army, various ministries, and the State Security Service.
In the 1960s, the National Defense Council decided on a first program of near to 50 bunkers to ensure the military defense of the country. A second program then increased this number to 100, including Soviet installations on East German territory. The country may have been tiny, yet it had the highest density of bunkers in Europe.
der höchsten Bunkerdichten in Gesamteuropa.
During the Cold War, bunkers are more important than housing. It's a choice later generations find hard to accept.
Ich würde mir wirklich wünschen, dass Menschen Zugang
I really
zu dieser
wish that people got access to this site, notably to the bunker, so that they can see for themselves the madness that has been going on.
Wahnsinn betrieben, wenn es denn zum
If there had been a nuclear war, all this would have been completely useless.
völlig sinnlos hier. Völlig sinnlos.
What good is it if I leave the bunker after 2 weeks and there's nothing left outside?
Und es ist nichts mehr da. Hier, deswegen diese.
When you look at it in retrospect,
Das aus heutiger Sicht
it hurts.
zu begreifen, das tut weh.
Pensive words by an officer who served 8 years of his service life in this bunker. In Strausberg, they've opted for a positive approach. The bunker is not only to serve as a museum with a view to conveying the history behind it, but also as a place for exhibitions and cultural events. A bunker for the future. A country in southeastern Europe holds a special place in the history of bunkers. In 1972, Albania starts a near-compulsive building program. Nobody can tell how many there are. Estimates range between 200,000 and 750,000 bunkers. Quite a feat for a country with 2.8 million inhabitants that's even smaller than Belgium. Most European bunkers are well camouflaged and hidden. In Albania, they're part of the landscape. A fact that draws amusement in foreign media when the country becomes accessible in the early 1990s.
Tiny cupolas dominate Albania's meadows and fields. The bizarre fortifications stretch right into the inhabited areas. They seem to have a habit of appearing in groups. This farmer counts no less than 8 of them on his property. Instead of soldiers, this one is now manned by a cow. Hodja would have had us hanged for this, but luckily democracy has won, so we're left with bunkers to do as we please. The cows will now defend them.
The drama of the tiny Balkan state begins in 1939, when the Kingdom of Albania is occupied by fascist Italy. 4 years later, the Germans take over. The country's partisans are led by the cadres of the Communist Party. One of them is 35-year-old Enver Hoxha. He will rule the country as a dictator for more than 4 decades. Hoxha is a somewhat mysterious figure. He studies law in France and Belgium, leaves without a diploma, teaches French in Albania, then opens a tobacco store in Tirana, the country's capital. During the Italian occupation, he suddenly emerges in the upper ranks of the Communist Party. In 1943, he becomes its chairman and the country's prime minister 1 year later. The legacy of Enver Hoxha, a destitute country in total isolation, grotesquely studded with myriads of tiny bunkers, even on the most idyllic beaches of the Mediterranean Sea.
Of
course, Hoxha is responsible for all that happened from World War II until his death in 1985. And that goes for our isolation, too. Albania is, let us say, somewhat special in the sense that it often switched sides within the communist system.
In 1959, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev pays Albania a visit. Moscow is the new big brother, since the Albanians turned their back on communist Yugoslavia at the end of the 1940s. Yet when the USSR invades Czechoslovakia in 1968, Tirana breaks ties with Russia too.
Then Albania turned to China as a partner, only to break with the regime there. And then there was the question, where now?
Enver Hoxha has turned his back on everyone. Communist Albania feels threatened by the West, as well as by its former Eastern allies, and even faraway China.
Albania is a bit of a basket case, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's in this own little bubble. It shuts itself from the outside world. They actually call themselves the Labour Party of Albania rather than the Communist Party, but actually they're more communist than the communists. It is totally shuts itself off from the rest of the world, shuts itself off from the Warsaw Pact by the 1970s. And, it's just in its own little bubble of unreality.
A country between all fronts. It's Albania versus the rest of the world. Its entire population is called up to man hundreds of thousands of bunkers to defend the country against potential invaders. Alas, the bunkers are only designed for conventional warfare and of no use in case of a nuclear strike. Nevertheless, the program is implemented to an unprecedented extent.
To improve the country's defences, bunkers were built. First along the northern and southern borders. Later, as there were ever more weapons in the region, bunkers were spread throughout the entire country, along the borders as well as inland. The greatest period of growth was during the 1970s.
Back then, notably the coastline is fortified. A middle-sized emplacement with 4 artillery bunkers and a command post in northwestern Albania. It's intended as a first stop against a potential invader to give the army time to withdraw into the mountains and continue with guerrilla warfare.
It is important for the Albanian people to feel that they are being defended, and when they're being shut out from the rest of the world, to have lots of bunkers tells the rest of the Albanian people who know nothing about the outside world, or very little, it tells them that they are being defended, that the government is putting up a defensive system, that they are safe. So it is a process of reinforcing the regime's own authority rather than any realistic attempt to block out any enemy attack.
The better part of the civilian population is trained in bunker warfare. Workers, students, even school children. The entire country is turned into a combat zone. Under the omnipresent cupolas of concrete, the idea of war takes on a grim reality.
You'd have to shoot from inside the bunker, and then you'd be bombarded from all sides. That's something quite different from the mere idea of defending your country. Once inside, you realize the ugliness of the whole thing.
On the fringes of Tirana, a strange entrance into a tunnel. Once the area was thoroughly sealed off as a restricted military zone, completely unknown to the capital's inhabitants. The tunnel opens onto a park, a playground for children, where no child was ever intended to play. It's all camouflage. The playground leads to the entrance of Albania's main bunker. This one is nuclear-proof, since it was to act as shelter for the country's military and political elite. 106 rooms, 200,000 square meters of available space. Right behind the entrance, the obligatory lock for decontamination. In case of a nuclear or chemical attack, everyone would have had to be cleansed here before entering the bunker. Its other parts are hermetically sealed off.
This bunker is unique. There are others, but none of this size. There were smaller ones as shelters for mid-level functionaries and for the population.
Today, the bunker is a museum. One of its rooms strikingly illustrates that Albania's military even experimented with chemical weapons, then, as now, banned internationally. Images of simulated chemical warfare speak of the naive faith in protective gear. As the Albanians expected their countless enemies to act as they would have done, the bunker is provided with an air filter system. Yet there's also space for entertainment, a stage and a screen. A convenient environment to applaud the achievements of the army and those of their great leader, Enver Hoxha.
This bunker was for general staff of the army, of course. The furniture, the equipments inside were the best of that time. So, of course, we can consider it luxurious, but of that period of time.
The rooms of the man at the top. He would go on to decide his country's fate from here. Comfort and luxury as far as the limited resources allowed. The dictator's calendar. It even provides some reading matter. Life in the bunker. Under the red flag, complete with the Albanian eagle emblem and ample space for an undisturbed sleep. When Enver Hoxha dies in 1985, there is mourning, real as well as commandeered. The dictator may be gone, but his legacy, the bunkers, remain. Albania's older generation visits the museum only rarely. They prefer to leave the past behind. So it's mainly directed at the young among the capital's population. Skanderbeg Square in Tirana. Today it's overlooked by Albania's national hero of the 15th century, George Kastrioti, called Skanderbeg, whose statue has replaced that of Joseph Stalin. The numerous monuments dedicated to Enver Hoxha have disappeared too. Only the mural on the National Museum of History is a reminder of the socialist era. Close by, the former bunker of the Ministry of the Interior. As it was to shelter the elite, it was designed to be nuclear-proof. Today it houses the museum Bunkart 2. The dome above the entrance is dedicated to the victims of the communist dictatorship. Intellectuals, artists, opponents to the regime. However, to some, personal matters seem more important than their country's past. An artist's reflection of oppression and persecution. The names of those arrested by the regime in the shelter of their former tormentors.
Albania's recent history hasn't really been addressed. That explains why there is still a strong resistance to any modern ideas to use relics of communism and the Cold War in a creative way. Many of the old functionaries are still alive and are well aware of their role back then. So, of course, they don't want this to be dealt with in public. Up until now, only the names of the victims have been documented. But it's just a matter of time until the names of the perpetrators will become known too. That's why many oppose using such places as museums.
Albania is one of the few countries which threw off the yoke of fascism without help from the outside. Using this foundational myth as a basis, Enver Hoxha led the country into Stalinist communism. After his death, Albanians opted for a modern future. Alas, their country is still one of the poorest in Europe. It's become a parliamentary republic, yet many want to ignore the shadows of the past. However, concrete witnesses are omnipresent. Its bunkers have become a trademark of the tiny country. They've lost their military meaning and are being used as restaurants, for commercial purposes, or as stores. To most Albanians, they're just part of their everyday life.
These bunkers were never used for their proper function. They exemplify the aesthetics of ugliness, which attracts foreigners. Yet they also provoke us into facing our history, those final years of communism, by just being there as real and tangible relics.
Albania's bunkers have lost their threatening appearance and have become a bizarre adventure playground for grown-ups. Bunkers of the nuclear age, megalomania in concrete. Billions of dollars for a war nobody could win. Part of a technology that might have wiped out all of us. Monuments of a Cold War that could easily have turned hot.